Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? How many acronyms can we fit into research software ecosystem? Excellent questions that we will be looking into today. I am Richard Littauer, your host. Hi, everyone. That was still me, same person, just a higher voice there. I'm the solo host today, which is fine, because I'm joined by one of my favorite collaborators, Michelle Barker. Michelle, how are you doing today?
Hi, Richard. It's really great to be here. I'm doing really well and excited to be able to have this chat today.
I'm excited as well. Michelle is joining me on my side of the globe, which is actually her side of the globe because she's actually from down under, calling in today from Cairns, Australia, or Cairns from everyone else in the world. Michelle is the director of ReSA, the Research Software Alliance, and as well as an independent open science consultant, which is always really exciting to me that there are people out there whose sole job is to work with other communities and things to figure out how can they all work better and make science better as a whole without having to work at a university and teach and stuff like that. They're just yeah, I'm out there trying to make open science as a whole better. Michelle has been working in this field for a long time, which is really, really cool because she has a ton of experience to give to certain things. ReSA was founded in 2019, which is exciting because it's already seen a huge amount of impact from my perspective. They do a ton of different stuff, which we're going to get into in a bit. But before that, Michelle Barker was also the director of the Australian Research Data Commons, the ARDC, which is really exciting, as well as having been in open science for a while. Her background is a sociologist in general. So, Michelle, now that I've just given away all the fun secrets, can you tell me, how did you get into open source and open science?
You've also promoted me. I should correct that I was one of the directors of the Australian Research Data Commons, not the sole head honcho. How did I get involved in open science and open source software? So I'm a sociologist originally. That's what my academic calling was. And when I started working in that field as a lecturer in about 2000, I noticed that there was this thing around called the internet. And technology seemed to be taking off as a way to enhance collaboration and a tool that could be used in education and research and learning. So as a sociologist, my key areas of interest are how do you get large-scale cultural change, and also how do you get organizational change? And so I started focusing on projects that looked a lot at how to use this newfangled technology like the internet to enable that. So for example, in 2000, when I was actually teaching in New Zealand, I ran the first ever course at Victoria University of Wellington that required students to access the internet to do some of their research for the course each week. And a few of the students complained, and there was an article in the local student newsletter because this was unheard of, that it was a requirement of the course that they access the internet, even though we'd arranged free access through the library, etc. And then over the course of my career, I just stayed interested in technology advancements and how to use them to get people talking to each other and how they're used in research. And over time, developed a specialization in using those tools. And then when that became open science, I was a specialist in that. And particularly when I was at the Australian Research Data Commons, I was leading national funding for research software infrastructure. So that's when my specialization in research software really evolved. And from after 5 years there, it was a natural evolution to then look at research software internationally in this role for ReSA.
I wish you hadn't introduced the internet to Victoria University of Wellington. As a student there, it's just dealing with their systems is very, very difficult. Just let me say, just had to put that in somehow. But that's exciting. That's a lot of work and that's a whole career arc, which is really cool and different because a lot of people in open source, open science, which are often viewed as contiguous, but are slightly different in a few different ways. Very useful explanation, Richard. Thank you. A lot of people who are in this field, started 2015, 2020, something new. There's not a lot who have been around since around 2000, since before open science became a big deal. So I guess a question I have for you is ReSA, right? The Research Software Alliance focuses on research software. Now, we've had a lot of people on the podcast before in the past that were research software people. We've had Neil Chu Hong recently. We've had a few others. Tell me why you narrowed in on that segment. Why research software? Why not open data? Why not Wikidata? Why not something else?
When we started thinking about forming this, and Neil Chu Hong was one of the co-founders with myself and Dan Katz from the US. it was an area that we shared a passion for and could see that there was no international coordination on. So at that time, there were good organizations doing coordination of research data, like the Research Data Alliance and CODATA, part of the International Science Council. But there was no equivalent for research software or for any type of software used in research. But we could see that there were lots of fantastic national efforts and disciplinary efforts and thematic efforts like in training or around career paths. But they never came together to talk about how they could influence international conversation. So soon after that, conversations like the formation of the UNESCO recommendation on open science happened. And there was no way for the research software community to be represented except through peripherally through open data representatives or through people like Neil and Dan and I talking to other people who were on the committee. So we wanted to create an opportunity for the community to come together and be represented internationally, but also then for the community to work together internally. So where all those fantastic national, disciplinary and thematic efforts existed, that we could see there was some siloization or duplication. So we wanted to ensure that collaborations started to form where they should. At that time in research software, I often say that if you wanted to know who else was working on something in your area, beyond your immediate circle of friends, you had to lurk in the right corridors at the right conferences to access other networks to find out where someone else in another country or another discipline or some other area was solving a similar problem. And, that's not very democratic or accessible. So we really wanted to take a lot of that knowledge out and put it in the open so that information flow could increase and people could benefit from learnings of what everyone else was doing and leverage those, and then identify places where people were dealing with the same issues, and therefore if they came together as part of an international working group, could come up with an international solution that helped them as well as creating an international solution.
Tell me about how ReSA does that. Do you have chapters? Do you have conferences? What does your constituency look like?
Yeah, we have an engagement plan which has 3 major pathways. The first is that we enable exchange of information to increase knowledge flow in the community. So we do a lot of standard things like a newsletter and social media. We have a few databases that we maintain, such as what's available in funding specifically for research software or policies that support research software in research organizations. Then our second pillar is probably where we do the most of our work, where we aim to engage community collaborations to solve common issues. So we do that primarily through stakeholder forum. So for example, for 3 years, we've been running the Research Software Funders Forum, which over 60 different funding organizations have engaged with, from national funders, philanthropic funders, and industry funders. And they come together to share best practices and network and identify where they could work collectively to solve common problems. We also have another forum on research software infrastructure providers. We support the International Council of RSE associations, where the National Research Software Engineering or RSE associations come together as well. So we enable those kinds of conversations across common stakeholder groups so they can think about where they might want to work together collaboratively. And then the second major area is what we call task forces, but are working groups where members of the community identify a problem. We help connect them with other people internationally with the same problem. They form a task force and we help promote the existence of that task force, find the members, promote their engagement with their community and whatever outputs they come up with. And some of the task forces we've had, for example, wrote the Fair for Research Software Principles 2.5 years ago as a major output. And we've got other ones at the moment continuing some work on fair for research software and looking at things like code availability and code authorship as well.
Now, I know that there are various RSE communities in the world. So there's UK RSE, there's RSE AUNZ, and there's US RSE, which has their conference coming up in October. The RFP is still open. You should all submit to it. Are these related to ReSA? Because they have a very similar acronym.
The Research Software Alliance aims to work across the entirety of the research software community. So that includes organizations like national RSE associations, but it also includes a whole lot of other stakeholder groups like funders and policymakers, research software infrastructure providers, research performing organizations, university consortia, researchers on research, meta scientists, etc. So whilst RSE communities are one of the very important stakeholder groups for us, they're only one of the stakeholder groups. However, we definitely all share the same aim of wanting to see improved recognition and support for research software and the people that develop and maintain research software.
Okay, cool. Tell me about how research software is exactly the same as open source.
It's not exactly the same, but it's heavily overlapping. One of the interesting things about research software, which we define as software that's been developed within the research context to solve a research problem. And research software is not the same as software used in research, which could include Microsoft or all sorts of other things that aren't specific to the research community. So one of the interesting things about research software is we don't actually know how much of it's open source. The majority, probably, we would guess anecdotally, but there's no data on that. And there's certainly some research software which is not open for very valid reasons, in the same way that research data is as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And we can see this variation in research software. So most research software is open source software, just developed by the research community, but not all.
So you had some pretty clear distinctions there because you've been asked this question before, right? So no, it's not. This is what research software is, and it's only this and nothing else. That didn't come out of nothing. So at some point, you all had to sit down in the room and say, no, this is research software and that's not research software, right? So the entire Docker ecosystem isn't research software because it's also used by industry and it's not always used to make fancy PDFs that end up in a journal. But scientists also use Docker. So how did you make that distinction and why? To say that it's not research software if it's being used all the time by researchers, right? What gives?
The group that came together to write the FAIR for Research Software Principles, which I guess started in late 2020, one of their early issues was how are we going to define research software? Because of course there's different definitions that exist in different papers. How do we come up with a definition that is agreed to by the community and could become commonly used? So a sub-working group formed in about 2021 and wrote a paper that I can give you a link to about how to define research software, and convened a community discussion about this and came up with the particular definition that we use. So I wasn't part of that group, but that was how that definition came about.
So you said that you work largely at sort of the infrastructural level, at the policy level. You work collaborating with institutions. You're not out in the field teaching lowly undergrads how to run R. You're a bit higher than that. You work by convening funders, for example, right? The International Funders Forum. It's really great. Let's get everyone from Sloan and Ford and all these, Chan Zuckerberg. Let's put them all in the room and have them all talk to each other. That's cool. How do you track engagement? What are your deliverables that you have to do? How do you know that the work is happening?
It's a really good question. And I think it's still a common issue for many social infrastructures, which is what we consider ourselves, to be able to track engagement. So there's certainly metrics like the number of newsletter subscribers you have, or the number of times that a position paper is downloaded or cited, or the number of people that you've engaged through a working group, the number of people that come to community consultations, or we just recently had a community consultation on our draft strategic plan for et cetera. I'm not sure that we've still really got to the heart of how to measure the value of social infrastructures like the Research Software Alliance. So always keen for new ideas on how to do that better.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you because you're a sociologist, and so it makes it easy. I haven't heard the term social infrastructures before on this podcast, which is really exciting. We've heard digital infrastructure, right? So I used to be the grant manager, or whatever you want to call it, community manager for the Digital Infrastructure Fund, the DIF. It's now the Digital Infrastructure Insights Fund, DIIF. I think largely because they couldn't get the domain name and I was out hiking for a month in Vermont, but I'm sorry about that. But it worked out. And digital infrastructure is really easy to grasp. Hey, everyone uses the internet. Without the internet, you can't get things delivered from Amazon, and therefore we're all going to die, right? No, we all have to have digital infrastructure there. Social infrastructures is a bit different. And as a sociologist, I can see why you would put that perspective on it. Hey, we're out here providing the infrastructure for people to connect with each other, which sounds a lot like, to me, a lot of the work happening in open source. For instance, you could say the OSI is a social infrastructure group. because they just connect lawyers and people who are confused about licenses to talk to each other. And by connect, I mean they have a website where you can talk about these things and look at them. Does that sound accurate to you? Is my understanding of that term sound correct?
I think so. You're making me realize I don't actually have a set definition for social infrastructure ready to reel off, but certainly there's large parts of the community that utilize it. And I think there's been a growth in, the last 5 to 10 years in understanding that a key part of course, there has been a growth in the last 5 to 10 years in understanding that a key part of software development is engaging the community and thinking about the maintainers and the volunteers and the governance structures and all those things that involve people. So how you get people engaging with people, I guess, is to the heart of social infrastructure. We've also seen the rise of positions like community managers, particularly in the research community, but I think more broadly in recognition that they have a role in enabling the social elements, enabling people to come together and do knowledge exchange and share best practices and network and find support and find a feeling of belonging and enable better collaborations. So I guess that's what social infrastructure is. And I think what you've described makes sense.
I really like this framing. It helps explain to me how ReSA fits in to the larger open source community. Because for me, I mean, this podcast is about open source, right? And a lot of open source is academic, and I'm talking about that more often than normal. Sorry, listeners, because I'm more interested in academia at the moment, and it just sort of happens. If you have other people I should talk to and you have funding to help pay for the podcast, get in touch. That's to you. But back to social infrastructures, it helps me figure out, okay, no, this is what connects here, and this is what connects here, and this is how these things work. What's difficult about that work? We've already talked about it's hard to get clear feedback sometimes that the work is happening. It's hard to have clear metrics for social infrastructures. For someone who's built an app or someone who wrote a tool that's used by scientists, it's very easy. Hey, I built a tool for CRISPR. I wrote a paper about it, and then now it's in Nature's top 25 most cited papers. That was a cool article that just came out recently. Yes, awesome, great, very easy. For the NSF, how do we judge their impact? For ReSA, how do we judge its impact? Or for, the OSI and for other social infrastructures, how do we do that? And so I'm just curious, besides that particular point, what's really hard about being a social infrastructure? What keeps you up at night?
I think another large part of the challenge is how to motivate groups of people to work together. So often I will see a range of people or organizations struggling with the same issue, and I'll connect them. Hey, this person over there is looking at your issue or even has a solution to your issue. Maybe you should chat to them. But it doesn't always happen, of course, because sometimes there's the not invented here syndrome, or people are busy, or people find it difficult to chat to someone else, or they're different personalities and it doesn't mesh. So I think a lot of the work of social infrastructures, or ReSA as well, is facilitating that conversation in such a way that we help those people identify that they're working towards the same higher level strategic goal. That even though their immediate goal might be to solve this problem for their organization or their discipline or their country, actually it's the same problem, and that there is benefit in understanding how someone else has solved it in a different environment, coming up with a broader solution. So helping people see the commonalities and that the benefits of working together to a higher strategic vision.
I used to be a street seller. I wore a fancy costume and I stood on the street in Edinburgh next to the castle on the Royal Mile. And I tried to yell at people to get them to come into the camera obscura in the world of illusions. I learned how to juggle badly because people look at you more when you juggle badly than if you juggle well. They're just like, why is that person messing up? And I say, come on in and see better juggling over here. I had to learn very quickly, there are ways to get to people and there are ways to not get to people. And there are ways you can be more effective and ways you can be less effective. I was less effective as a whole at that job. Didn't know yet. That was not the job that was for me. That's okay. I can be loud and tell people to come in, and that's what I did. When I'm connecting people now in my job, I can't just shout at them and say, come into the building. I have to try more devious tactics. Hey, here's a Google Doc, and I have some spelling errors in it. Do you want to fix it? Hey, here's a workshop, and the pastries are particularly nice this week. What tools do you have in your toolbox that you use to help get people in the door, to help people realize that you actually have something that maybe they could learn, or maybe you have a connection that they could, learn from?
It's a skill set that I didn't realize not everyone had, because it was something that is quite key to my personality. I am a social connector. So, for example, if I'm introducing two people, I'll never say A meet B. I'll tell them what their connection is. Hey, you both went to the same high school, or you both have a passion for X, and give them a way to connect. And I didn't ever understand that was not normal until once I was talking to a data colleague about how I prepare to go to a conference, that I will go through the list of attendees if it's available and speakers, and think about who I really like to prioritize chatting with. And I'll put them in groups. There'll be ones that it's going to be difficult to get their attention. And so I might have to time it just right after their talk when they're leaving the auditorium to get a minute with them to try and get their attention. And then there's people a second group of people who happily talk to me, and I can just write to them and ask, can we do lunch together? And then I always leave time in my schedule for kind of serendipitous outcomes to just talk to people at breaks, because you never know who's going to actually be a really important person to meet. And my colleague was astounded by this. He said he just turns up and talks to whoever happens to be available. He said, there's an algorithm for social connection. And I was astounded by his way of describing it, because I'd never thought about that. And it's like, yes, there's a methodology for figuring out how to talk to people. And yes, if I'm really wanting to speak to someone that I don't know well, I might have researched their background so I can start the conversation rolling. You build an emotional connection or a personal connection, or figured out what I can say about me that's going to spark just enough interest that then when I email them a few days later, they'll read the email, for example. So let me just tie that back to your original question. So I guess ReSA is trying to do that at an international level, that, for example, our newsletters have a broad range of things in them that might be of interest to stakeholders, ranging from a national policy maker to a lead of a national research software engineering association. And we'll put some of the context, or, how is this relevant to you? Why should you be involved? So I guess, at the broader level, at organizational level, we're starting new forums or task forces. It comes back to that technique of encouraging people to see the benefit. And as I'm explaining this, I'm feeling like I'm just saying what a marketing technique is, that in some ways very similar to what you were probably doing, perhaps badly, as a street seller, but to be able to understand what might be important to them and link it to something that's important to me or others, and therefore build the connection.
I've gotten better. I have that whole checklist before this podcast I have jokes built into that checklist at certain times, because I've learned that it works better to get people to feel better. That's okay. It is an algorithm. I always wonder if you have to be slightly sociopathic to think that way, but it does seem to work. Like, I'm going to plan out my day, and here's the people I'm going to talk to, and I'm going to try to connect them in this way. That makes perfect sense to me. I think it'd be news to most people. So thank you for sharing.
I hadn't realized that was slightly sociopathic.
Maybe that's just me. I just think it's leaving. Sometimes I imagine all the cool kids at high school who are older and prettier than me. They just let life happen to them, and it seemed to work. They walked into a room and everyone was their friend. I had to work at it, right? It wasn't easy, and I wasn't good at it for a long time. And then slowly, over a period, you learn how to do things. So let's move on. This is very silly. It's interesting to me. I keep trying to tie it back to like maintainers and try to talk, well, like, how do you think about people coming into your project, or people who run large projects already? How do you think about getting funders on board, right? You can't just send them an email in the dead of night saying, I need money. You have to think about, well, I've met this person here and I know them from here, and this is what they're interested in, and this is what they want to do with their funds. So where do I fit in that framework? Then work from there. So like, I'm thinking about all these different aspects, because I feel like what you do at ReSA is very similar to what a lot of large open source projects do. And it's cool because you're doing it for software, a lot of which is already open source, which is great. It's all related. I know that you have a new strategy plan rolling out. Can you tell me about what's different?
Yes, we are now outlining our next 3 years of operation and what we aim to achieve. So we have built an ambitious plan to continue a lot of the work we already do in enabling knowledge flow and building more task forces and more stakeholder forums with different groups. But we'd also like the opportunity, if we can get support to do so, to add in some other elements, such as convening an international research software conference, because there's nothing in the particular way that we're defining that exists in that space at the moment. To look at things like an international research software and or its personnel awards program, because there's some wonderful national awards programs now existing as exemplars. To think about other baseline data we need as a research software community about some of our challenges and successes, and whether we should be thinking about things like journal special issues to better promote research software, or perhaps even a new journal. And the other major new element of our strategic plan is, earlier I spoke about how we have three major ways of engaging. And I didn't get to the third, which is that we aim to evolve the governance of a global community. So as we've been building a number of stakeholder forums, and we'll be continuing to do so this year, we then like to add another tier, which we're calling the Community Leadership Forum, which would be a grouping which we're still figuring out exactly how it will function, but perhaps with elected representatives from some of the stakeholder forums. We'll need to add in some other groups that aren't being represented through forums to make sure we're not excluding voices, but could function as some kind of vaguely democratically elected, transparently working international body that can think about the research software community as a whole. And in the long term could evolve as it matures to do something like a decadal plan for research software. So if we can get representatives, all the different parts of the research software community, and that'll take us time. We're not going to get it done perfectly in the first year. Then they could function in the same way that we see, astronomy community or high energy physics doing so well to work internationally. To think about what are the priorities of the community and who has specializations in what areas and how could they be supported, or where are the gaps that no one's working on. So how to solve some of the problems within the community, then also how to represent that community more broadly in bigger international discussions, be it about open science or the research sector or open source software and in industry, but to be some kind of organization that can function in that way.
How do you think about thematically forming a field? I mean, it sounds like you've already done this with research software, but it sounds like you're kind of trying to do it again. You're trying to figure out how do we get these different stakeholders involved and how do we move them? How do you put them in your head? Do you have a flow chart? Do you have Venn diagrams? Like, what do you do to think about this is where we want to be? And how do you decide which people are in that group?
I really like your framing about it. We're trying to define a field because, of course, there are other endeavors that do that. For example, a German-based group, but RSER, looking at research on research software, so one of the early meta-science groups. But I guess they're defining the field in some ways as well. We have nice diagrams about all of the different stakeholders, but we don't have flowcharts or hierarchies. We just have lists of these are all the stakeholders that need to be involved. We have one Venn diagram that shows that research software is in the middle of the research community and the open source software community. They're both important in the broader aspects. But yeah, that's as complicated as our diagrams go at the moment.
That's okay. It's probably simpler that way. When we talk about research, I often think of the difficulties of research. Federal funding going away, difficulties involving partnerships across borders, difficulties of cuts to university funding and less students coming in, and research software people themselves not being remunerated for their labor or not being cited for their labor, and research software being a second-class citizen. That all sucks. And open source also all sucks, right? It's really hard to organize. It's hard to figure out how people are using your code. Maintenance is horrible. I don't want to deal with any issues anymore. We're all getting older and gray, and it's all white men, right? That all sucks too. And so they both kind of have this Venn diagram of like everything is awful. So what's interesting about having you on is that research software really does sit at this crux between open source and research. And that means it has all the issues of both. Research is difficult because funding is hard, because new students aren't coming, because of international issues around science. Open source is hard because maintenance is difficult, and it's hard to figure out how people are using your code, and you're on the hook for it forever. And it's just really, really hard. And so you have all these massive structural problems that you need to solve. And so what does it mean to you to sustain research software? How do you think about that question?
Well, there's a lot of challenges that exist. There's also amazing benefits. So a lot of the approach is to spotlight the successes that we see, especially where countries or organizations or disciplines have supported research software and its personnel and are then able to demonstrate the benefits in terms of increased research outputs. It seems like a very simple answer. Is that enough?
No, simple answers are the best. There are a lot of benefits. In fact, I was trying to end us on a high note because we are running up on time. So thank you so much. That's great. Where can people learn more about ReSA?
You can learn more about the Research Software Alliance at our website at researchsoft.org, which also has links to subscribe to our monthly newsletter or links to our social media on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and Mastodon.
So do check those out. We'll put those links in the show notes, everyone. You can get those show notes by going to podcast@thesaintoss.org. Don't leave yet. At the end of every show, we have Spotlight. Spotlight is the part of the show where we highlight other people, projects, or things that we think just need a little bit of light shed on them. My spotlight today is going to be NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is responsible for a ton of weather data all over the world, used by tons and tons of researchers. And also, like, if you've ever seen the Weather Channel, that was NOAA at work. They're the best. They're really great. They're being gutted right now by the current American administration, which I think really sucks because NOAA provides more value than like so many things that don't need to be funded. So just shout out to them. I've been using some NOAA data in my research, and I'm just really grateful that it exists. So thank you, NOAA, for being amazing. Michelle, what is your spotlight today?
I'd like to highlight a very small project called Softcite, which is a project that studies how researchers use, cite, and collaborate around software. And they produce dataset, some software, and some papers. There's a new paper just out that shares software mention extractions from 24 million open access papers. And the reason I love their work is because it's so critical for us to be able to demonstrate the impact of research software and its personnel. And as we've already discussed at length, it's very difficult to do that, partly because the software citation pipeline doesn't exist very well at the moment. So these kind of efforts, and this is just an example, there's others I could have highlighted, are incredibly valuable. And I encourage people to go and mine that data set and use it to show the impact of research software and possibly even their own software if it's mentioned in that. I would also add that when I came to this question, I almost suggested that for me, it be reworded to what's a community I would like to shine a spotlight on, coming back to the social infrastructure field. And I would have highlighted all of the national and regional and local research software engineering associations around the world, which is completely a social infrastructure in that it's usually run by volunteers, not always. Sometimes people are in paid roles within institutions, enabling sharing of networks and best practices and support. And it's been running for 10 plus years now and has had a fantastic impact on recognition and understanding of research software. And it's just an amazing exemplar of what a community can achieve together, led from grassroots up, and just fantastic.
That's a very Michelle reframe, which I really, really like. Back when we had another podcast host, Eric Berry, wherever you are, I love you, man. Regularly things like, this dog toy I got really made my dog's life better. And so the spectrum of what people think Spotlight should apply to is fantastic. Let's end on that note. Michelle, thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, I hope you have enjoyed this program. As I previously mentioned, we are looking for more funds. You can go to opencollective.com/thesainoss and donate there. That'd be really, really great. But if you don't have the ability to do that, tell your manager. If you don't have the ability to do that, tell your friends about this podcast, because word of mouth is really everything. Share it on all our socials. We are on Discord. We are on Mastodon. We are on LinkedIn. We are on Blue Sky, and that is the limit of our social networks for obvious reasons. You can also go to podcast.thesainoss.org to see the show notes for this episode, as well as all the other 350 odd episodes, which we've had over time. And you can email me and the other hosts at podcast@sustainoss.org. Very simple naming schemes. Do check out the Research Software Alliance. Michelle, thank you so much for coming on. This is absolutely excellent. Best of luck with everything. And I'm excited to be part of this network as well. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard.